Life in the 1960s, a trip down memory lane. Whether you experienced the 1960s or are just curious, life in the 1960s, a trip down memory lane will give you insight into some of the events, fads, and lifestyles that marked that decade. Events of the 1960s. The decade of the 60s saw much turmoil, socially, politically, and culturally. Some might argue that the 60s saw more change and unrest than any other decade. Vietnam. In 1961 there were approximately 700 American military advisors in South Vietnam. They were sent there to contain guerrilla or communist activity. That number grew to over 12,000 in a little over a year. By 1963 this number grew even more to 16,000. Technically the United States never declared war on Vietnam. However, in 1964 the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution by the United States Congress authorized the escalation and use of military force in Vietnam. With the escalation of military force and the implementation of the military draft, by 1966, the number of troops soared to 500,000. The United States was heatedly divided between those in favor and those opposed to the United States' involvement in Vietnam. From the opposition, many protests took place. The United States didn't withdraw all of its troops until the 1970s. Bay of Pigs. In April of 1961, there was a failed attempt by the United States and its allies to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. A few years earlier, Fidel Castro had led an invasion into Havana, Cuba. The result was that he was responsible for overthrowing the American-backed president, General Fulgencio Batista. With the American-trained Cubans that had fled their homes when Castro took over, the United States launched an invasion to take power away from Castro. What happened was they were severely outnumbered by Castro's troops and surrendered within 24 hours. Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days in October 1962 the world watched as the Soviet Union and the United States had a military standoff between the two countries. The United States found the Soviet Union had begun to install nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, 90 miles from the United States. The Soviet Union did so to protect Cuba, which had become a communist country, from being overthrown by the United States. The United States blockaded the island to prevent further deliveries of nuclear missile heads by the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis came to an end with the Soviet Union removing its missiles from Cuba with the agreement that the United States wouldn't invade Cuba. It was also secretly agreed that the United States would remove U.S. missiles from Turkey. Thus nuclear war was diverted. Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall was a physical and psychological barrier that divided East and West Berlin during the Cold War. It was erected in 1961 as part of the division of Germany following World War II. The Soviet Union built the wall in 1961 as part of its strategy to restrict movement between East and West Germany as well as an effective way to prevent refugees from entering the former Soviet Union. A couple of decades later, on November 19, 1989, people protesting against communism gathered behind it to lay flowers at its foot before climbing over or breaking through it. This event signified the beginning of the end of communist rule in Europe and is considered one of history's most significant moments. Assassinations. John F. Kennedy, assassination, November 22, 1963. John F. Kennedy was the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated while riding in a motorcade in a convertible in Dallas, Texas. It is thought that Lee Harvey Oswald was the gunman. Though Oswald was apprehended, he was killed on November 24 by Jack Ruby. Ruby gave the reason for the killing as an outrage against Oswald's assassination of Kennedy. A jury found Ruby guilty of murder, but Ruby died from lung cancer while awaiting a new trial in 1967. Malcolm X, assassinated February 21, 1965. Malcolm X was an African-American nationalist and religious leader. In 1964 he founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He promoted the black identity and believed that racism, not the white race, was the greatest enemy of African Americans. Malcolm X encouraged the liberation of African Americans by any means necessary. He was assassinated by rival black Muslims while addressing his Organization of Afro-American Unity in New York on February 21, 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated April 4, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister who was a prominent figure in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. In contrast to Malcolm X, King's speeches advocated equality but through peaceful protests. One of his well-known speeches was "I Have a Dream," given on August 28, 1963. At the age of 35, he was the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. He was assassinated on April 4, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, by James Earl Ray. In 1969 Ray pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Over the years, Ray tried to recant his confession but failed and died in prison in 1998. Robert F. Kennedy, assassinated June 5, 1968. Robert F. Kennedy, brother of John F. Kennedy, was U.S. Attorney General and advisor during his brother's presidency. During this time, Robert Kennedy fought organized crime and worked for civil rights for African Americans. One prominent action he took was sending thousands of troops to Oxford, Mississippi, to enforce the Supreme Court order to admit James Meredith, the first black student, to the University of Mississippi. Working alongside his older brother and later President Lyndon B. Johnson, he was instrumental in the development of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act outlawed racial discrimination in voting, employment, and public facilities. As part of the Civil Rights Act was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a landmark legislation in the United States that prohibits discrimination based on race or color in voting by public institutions and their employees. While campaigning for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination, Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles on April 4, 1968. The assassin was a Palestinian immigrant, Sirhan Bashara Sirhan. Sirhan was convicted in 1969 of murder and sentenced to death. In 1972, the California Supreme Court outlawed capital punishment, and Sirhan's sentence was commuted to life in prison. Counterculture. The counterculture of the 1960s was an emerging schism between the conservatism of the older generation and the emerging liberal thoughts of the younger generation. This dichotomy sparked a social revolution. Not only with the conservative values coming into question, but the invasion of Vietnam became a breeding ground for protests. Young people who were part of the counterculture were known as hippies. The quest for a moral liberal culture included sexual revolution. A new questioning of authority also arose, demanding more freedoms and rights for minorities and women. Two of the most well-known counterculture events were the Summer of Love, which took place in San Francisco in 1967, and the Woodstock Festival in upstate New York in 1969. The Summer of Love occurred when approximately 100,000 primarily young people converged on San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. The sentiment was one of music, hallucinogenic drugs, anti-war, and free love. Woodstock was a music festival promoted as 3 days of peace and music. It was held in upstate New York on a dairy farm owned by Max Yasgur. Over 400,000 people attended, with 32 bands performing. Woodstock was a reasonably peaceful event. There were 2 fatalities, one person died from insulin usage, and the other was run over by a tractor in a hayfield. Drug overdoses over the 3 days numbered 742. Women's movement. The women's movement in the 1960s was a time of significant change and progress for women. Although there had been previous movements like the suffrage movement, the 1960s saw a more widespread effort to combat discrimination and inequality against women. The feminist revolution began with landmark cases such as Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in America. Other events tied to the women's movement include Title IX, which requires equal access to education programs by men and women at U.S. colleges, passage of laws protecting working mothers, including maternity leave legislation in California, establishment of rape crisis centers around the United States, amendment of employment law outlawing sexual harassment in workplaces across all industries, finally giving employees recourse against such behavior. Science. Space exploration. The space race between the United States and the Soviet Union was going full force in the 1960s. Among successes, the Soviet Union sent the first man to space in April of 1961. In 1965 the Soviets launched Luna 10, which orbited the Moon. The tide started to turn in the mid-1960s, with the United States becoming dominant in space exploration. However, that dominance was met with tragedy when astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives on the launch pad when a fire swept through the command module of Apollo 1. This put a temporary hold on the space program for the United States. In 1969 Apollo 11 was launched into space. On July 20, 1969, the United States landed Apollo 11 on the Moon. This landing made history with the first man taking steps on the Moon. Mission Commander Neil Armstrong, Command Module Pilot Michael Collins, and the Lunar Module Pilot Buzz Aldrin made this historic mission. The famous words heard throughout the world, "That's one small step for man. One giant leap for mankind," are forever etched in our minds. Some scientific events of the 1960s. 1960, female birth control contraceptive, the pill, FDA approved and released. 1963, the measles vaccine was FDA approved and released. 1963, first human kidney transplant. Performed by transplant surgeon Thomas Starzl. 1967, first heart transplant, performed in South Africa by the surgeon and Professor Christiaan Barnard. Automobiles. With the 1960s, there came an onslaught of new-style automobiles in the United States. The big three automakers, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, dominated the industry in the United States, making up 93% of the cars produced and 48% worldwide. Because there are so many popular cars from the 1960s, I'm keeping the list short, but to see a more in-depth list go to the full article linked in the video description. 1960, Chevrolet Corvair, 1961, Chevrolet Impala, 1962, Ford Falcon, 1963, Buick Riviera, 1964, Corvette Stingray, 1965, Toyota 2000 GT, 1966, Chevrolet Camaro, 1967, Pontiac Firebird, 1968, Volkswagen Beetle, 1969 Datsun 240Z. Fashion. In the earlier years of the 1960s, conservative clothing was still being worn. The pillbox hat and skirt suits that Jacqueline Kennedy wore and brought to popularity abounded with women. But as the decade went on, nothing screams the 1960s like the miniskirt, go-go boots, tie-dye shirts, headbands, peace sign medallions, and hippie